Thank you for the introduction, August. I really appreciate it. I want to tell you a little bit about myself, because if you read in the manual, in the program guide, you'll see that I'm actually an ordained United Methodist clergy. And so you're going to be like, why in the world would you have an ordained United Methodist clergy speaking at the Secular Student Alliance? That didn't work. The background image didn't work, but we'll just see what happens with all of this PC thing over here that's not, for those of you that are Apple users like myself. So imagine for a second that a young, impressionable 18-year-old ends up on a college campus looking for a community of folks and ends up being befriended by a Methodist-related campus ministry at the University of Northern Iowa, and goes out and spends 4 years being introduced to progressive Christianity, and then decides to work for that said Methodist campus ministry, and then decides to go to seminary in Washington, D.C. and get 3 years of instruction from a United Methodist seminary, and then becomes a United Methodist clergy. And then shows up at the University of Minnesota and experiences 70 religiously affiliated groups and gets a little overwhelmed with his own belief structure. Then he goes out and meets this group on campus called the Campus Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists. Any of my cash people here, right there. And starts to ask himself what in the world he is doing as a Methodist. And then he goes to a Unitarian General Assembly and finds a home, and then goes to the Hillel Global Assembly and finds a bunch of people he likes, and then ends up meeting Chris Stedman, and then ends up reading Chris Stedman's book, and then gets introduced to all of these terms like secular humanism and agnosticism and atheism and all these things that I never thought that I was going to be, and then starts to realize that perhaps his own identity is shifting. Perhaps his own identity is coming more into whole self, and then he realizes that he's actually an ordained United Methodist clergy who's actually agnostic. That's where you have an ordained United Methodist clergy here. Now, don't tell anybody, or somebody might try to take my credentials away. But the reality is that entering that space and entering higher education and working in that intersection of this field that we call religious, secular, and spiritual identities, or at least the higher education world has come to call it that, is become kind of my life's work. I'm going to see how many times I have to press this button before it moves. I'm telling you, it's not going to work. How many times am I going to press the button? Or we're just going to leave it here all night. But it would be really helpful if we didn't.
Oh, that's not good. We're supposed to go here.
Right. That's the next slide. Excellent. So I've worked for about 11 years on college campuses since I graduated as an undergrad. And in that time and in the work that I've done, I ended up through my own identity, figuring out that what I was really looking at was the intersectional work of higher education. And I did a research study about 4 years ago in the US and Canada, and what came out was a lot of conversation about how do we adjust the entire campus climate. So it wasn't just at an individual level, it was at the holistic level of the university. And I did this work for this student affairs organization, and that work actually has ended. August is getting a little bit of a relayed information that actually position has ended. And now what's happening is that we're founding a group of us, and Nick Stancato, who you all know is on this advisory board, we're forming this organization called Convergence. And some of you have heard about the Interfaith Youth Corps, and Convergence is meant to pair with the Interfaith Youth Corps in a lot of ways. But our focus is on really kind of that campus climate structure work. And so what I'm going to do tonight is kind of talk about what you all as secular students bring to that table, and the importance of the work that we're doing on campus and that we can do together. So, how many of you know that on December 16th, Barack Obama signed into law the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act? How many of you know this? Just a few of you. So that's what we're talking about. This is the legal measure that I think is important for you to know about when you leave here. I won't have given you all the information. I'm sure that you all have lawyers that you know. How many lawyers are in the room? Look at that, the lawyers in the room. They're going to be very helpful for this conversation. They're going to tell me that I'm wrong, and that's going to be good. This law is really important for all of you. And this is my short and sweet 20 minutes, less than 20 minutes now, telling you why this is so important. So first, in 1998, there was this act called the Frank Wolf International Religious Protections Act. It specifically laid out that in terms of U.S. international relations, that religious belief was meant to be carried over, and something that we looked at as international policy, and how we were addressing the rights of individuals as we were doing foreign policy. And it requires that the State Department report on the international state of religious affairs. And then, of course, it promotes the religious freedom in the U.S. and of its citizens. This all started back in the mid-90s and was signed into law in 1998 because of this person. How many in the room know who this person is? Okay, so those of you that are not lawyers in the room, who is this? Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State, first woman who was Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001. Madeleine Albright was known for saying, while she was Secretary of State, that the U.S. foreign policy around religious and non-religious beliefs was something that was badly missing in terms of the work that was happening at the State Department. And so she pressed forward on this conversation. We were a little stymied by the second Bush administration to move this forward, but we all know that when Barack Obama came into office in 2009, anybody there at that inauguration? Nobody. Were you there? Oh, were you stuck in the tunnel? Oh, that's really sad. I was freezing, and I was freezing down the mall at about 15 degrees. When Obama came to office, it changed the dynamic of this and kind of brought back the late 90s conversation that Madeleine Albright and that Bill Clinton had brought into play. And of course, as some of you are aware, and some of you may have even participated in 2009, Barack Obama started the Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships Committee out of the White House. And started doing this work. These are some of the pictures of the inaugural members of that. My friend Anju Bhargava gave me this picture this morning. I asked her if she had any pictures, and she said yes, so she's the second one from the left there. She's the only Hindu that was on the initial Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. What makes this so important is built on the mission of the Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships itself. To promote student achievement by connecting schools and community-based organizations, both secular and faith-based. Now, I would argue that at the beginning there were some struggles as to how secular this committee was at the beginning, but I think that they've started to move in a more positive direction, or at least they did when there was one before January. Barack Obama wanted to move aggressively on this work and to move much more into helping promote this work. And so when Secretary of State, when he promoted John Kerry as Secretary of State, John Kerry went to work very quickly to move forward the policies or the intentions that Madeleine Albright had already had. And in 2013, he appointed a special advisor, special religious advisor. And at the installation of this, John Kerry said these words. He said, in fact, if I went back to college today, I think I would probably major in comparative religion, because that's how integrated religion is with everything that we're working on and deciding and thinking about in life today. That special advisor was a guy named Sean Casey. Sean Casey was actually a professor of mine when I was in seminary in Washington, D.C., and so I actually have a really close relationship with him. First person ever as the special representative for religion and global affairs. He likes to say this, quote, "Such work as we are doing can be compared to brain surgery, a necessary task but fatal if not done well." The reason why I bring this quote up is because Sean Casey actually was very well influenced in terms of this work. He served as special advisor on both of Barack Obama's campaigns before he was appointed to this position in 2013. One of the first conversations I had with Sean after he was appointed as special representative was that he said, we need to actually move forward this whole atheist, humanist, agnostic, non-religious area and really put it into play in terms of what he was doing. And so when he was traveling the globe and working with John Kerry, one of the things that he paid special attention to was that non-religious community. And it was a conversation that he had with John Kerry and kind of continued policy work that he was trying to bring about that brings us back to, I'm not getting my slides changing the way that I want them to, so I apologize. But what it does is it brings us back to this moment when Obama signed into office the International Religious Freedom Act on December 16th. It was signed into law on the exact same day that Obama was protecting the Arctic from the oil drilling and pieces like that. So it wasn't really well known. Now, what does this mean for us? That's the question of where we go. What do we do with that piece? The reality is that you all as secular students have this tremendous opportunity to change the dynamics on campus. And so much of this work that we're talking about and so much of this conversation that we're having here this week, as a religious professional, as somebody who is an ordained clergy, and even though I'm agnostic, as a religious professional, as somebody who's seen higher education, I'm here to tell you that there's a real opportunity and a real moment to exert some power if you can take this law and utilize it to your benefit. So already on campuses, as I've done consultation and had conversations with professionals, I've actually utilized this as a way to talk about how it's, when use of the religious, secular, and spiritual identity, that we need to be both protecting the secular and the humanist communities on campus by placing them under this religious umbrella. A lot of campuses, that I have worked with do not have any idea what to do with all of the secular community. And what I've said is, if you place them under this umbrella, it creates a safety net. Now, I know some of you in the room might say, that's crazy. Why in the world would we ever affiliate under a religious umbrella? And the reason why I would say this is because once you sit under the religious umbrella, then I think you can start to work on the other slide that I want to give you. There we go. Now imagine that I was going to actually click through each of these and that you're not seeing what's at the bottom, okay? You just have to imagine for a second. This is all about advocacy, okay? So you have to advocate for yourselves, but why would you advocate on behalf of others? So let me tell you a quick story of a few years ago. I was working with a university that will not be named, and that university had an issue in which the Islamic community had, obviously, Islamophobia came out on campus. There was chalk markings that were placed. There were posters that were placed all over campus. And it was the atheist community that came out first and foremost and actually stood up and protected the Islamic community. And when that happened, the administrators of the community, or the administrators on the campus, said, we didn't even actually know that the atheists believed in anything or that they stood for anything. And I said, it's amazing when you actually have a moment of crisis and you have communities outside of the community that's affected that become the most powerful advocacy pieces. And so what happens is there's this great creation of collaboration that takes place, and the university starts to see you for who you are. Not as just some outcast group or some group that doesn't have any belief structure or anything that they stand for, but rather as a community that actually matters in kind of the policy work that the university administrators are doing. And that was one of the first major steps for this school to actually see the secular community as part of the larger story of campus, not just, just out there, just hanging out. in so doing, the Muslim community on that campus now has built a really strong relationship with the secular community. And that has transcended over the generations of the college students over the last 5 years since that incident took place. Another piece is this question of leadership. How do we become advocates and take the leadership opportunities that we have? And this kind of exists under the other piece, this use of power. You know, one in four college students, and more than 1 in 4 college students are, you know, obviously secular students, atheist students, humanist students. And on our campuses, one of the things that I'm finding is, as we're building conversations with administrators about why this work matters and why we need to include these identities as part of our diversity work on campus, is built on the fact that when you all as students actually go out and you exert your power and exert that use of that understanding for administrators, that 1 in 4 of you are non-religious persons and come from these communities, and those leaders that you all are go out and actually have the conversations with administrators, it starts to change the conversation. And I would say that this conversation around this law is one of the great opportunities for you to lead, because there's so few professionals in higher education that actually know about this right now. So articulating that to them and sitting down with them and sharing with them that the U.S. foreign policy, which affects U.S. domestic policy, is actually looking at non-theists and atheists and humanists and all of this umbrella as under religious discrimination laws, and that whether you're a public or at a public university or at a private university, you can't just ignore this, and you can't just put us at arm's length. And you certainly can't allow especially evangelical Christians to just run around campus and create chaos for everybody else. And from this, I speak of this idea that Paul Wellstone, anybody know who Paul Wellstone is? Woo-hoo. There's somebody who knows who Paul Wellstone is. Who's Paul Wellstone, August?
He was a senator for Minnesota.
Right, he was a U.S. senator from Minnesota. I still say that, and I really do say this, now this is maybe just my Minnesotan coming out, but I really think that Bernie Sanders was just running Paul Wellstone's campaign for president in his absence. Paul Wellstone is well known for saying these words: "We all do better when we all do better." If we take this law and we take this work that is that we're being given an opportunity to do, and we look under that religious umbrella and we build up everybody at the table, or at least everybody at the table that wants to collaborate in the interfaith world, the reality is that we're going to create a much more hospitable campus for all of us. And maybe it's the atheist students that need to lead the way. There was a piece that was released on Being yesterday, Krista Tippett's piece about, by a chaplain at Davidson College named Elizabeth Welliver, who talked about how the nuns might be able to save Christianity. And it was an interesting piece, and I would encourage you to read it. It was really, really interesting, because it talks about not only about the idea that the nuns understand what perhaps Christianity is doing so wrong, but also this idea that if we work together and we collaborate, we can create these communities that are much more hospitable. The fifth thing in here is this creating practices on campus that enhance the campus climate for yourselves and for future students. If you become advocates and if you become leaders and you bring your group out there at the forefront. So I work at a university where the religious life on campus does not have a lot of, there is no person, there is no community that seems to be leading the way in terms of putting pressure on the university to create policies and practices. So I want to give you the example. So the University of Minnesota has 4,500 Muslim students and 1,500 Jewish students, and there's not a single halal and kosher option on the campus at all. Now, to atheist students, like I know you all are like, well, we don't need halal and kosher options, but the reality is that if the secular students were to exert power and to utilize their presence and to take that mass of individuals and to say to the campus, why are we not doing this? That starts to change the dialogue. And perhaps it's important to think about the fact that it's not just about our community, but it's about the entire campus and also about the entire campus climate. If we want to create an environment where that student who's coming for a campus visit wants to know that it's going to be safe for them to practice their non-religious or their humanist or wherever they exist on that worldview, are we not dedicated enough to our practice to protect and preserve that for the future by doing the advocacy work and exerting the leadership that we need now in our communities so that, like, those future generations know that when they come onto a campus, that work has been pre-built and done. The last piece of this is raising that level of awareness of the atheist and humanist agnostic communities that are out there. I can't tell you the number of campuses that I have literally been on in which administrators have been face-to-face with the evangelical Christian groups on campus or the Hillel students or the Muslim Student Association, and yet they have never once had a conversation with anyone from the campus freethinkers or the campus atheists or any of these secular student groups. They've never had those conversations. And by not having those conversations, you are isolating yourself from the policies that can take place on campus that can directly affect. I like to say that in the public university, and I was talking to Kevin about this earlier, we were having coffee earlier and talking about this. There is some data that's suggestive right now that when a university is, especially a public university that likes to be at arm's length of this approach, is not touching this religious, secular, and spiritual world and just looking at it and staying away from it and not setting policy and not having conversations about it, which is, of course, for some of you in the room is going to be like, yeah, that's exactly what we want. We don't want you to touch this because of separation of church and state. There's actually some data out there that suggests that a university not touching on this topic is actually allowing the cultural bias of Christianity to actually fester. So think about that for a minute. Imagine yourself on a campus where a university isn't willing to engage in this work, perhaps in some ways to the benefit of those of us that think that we should have a strong separation of church and state. But what happens is that the cultural narrative is perpetuating itself on campus, and then all of a sudden what we are seeing is a bias. So what I've started to see and what we're seeing in some of the data is suggestive that instead of just keeping an arm's length approach, actually engaging with the university might create a much more egalitarian and holistic approach that actually does create space for all of these communities, because we all know that evangelical Christianity is not going away and that it will continue to perpetuate itself on campus if our university campuses and our administrators don't actually take a stronger approach to making sure that that doesn't happen on campus. My time is almost up, which is amazing because I'm a pastor, so I preach all the time, and so I just talk and talk and talk. I can't believe I ran out of time. But what I want to do is I want to give you a chance, if you want, to ask any questions and any thoughts that you have. And if you have any of those leftover apples from dinner and want to throw them at me, you can do that. And the lawyers in the room can tell me that I'm completely wrong, and that's great. I'll take that too. I always like to say you can have questions, comments, or derogatory remarks if you'd like. So is there any questions or any thoughts about this? Are you all tired? Yes. There's a group of people that came in after my presentation. This is a good sign too. Yes. Yeah.
Would you recommend similar tactics for, I guess, more conservative groups as well?
So that's a really good question. So the question is, when reaching out to other religious groups on campus, do you have the same tactics for reaching out to conservative groups on campus? My argument is it depends. Okay, everything is always dependent. I don't think that any student leader ever should put themselves in a situation of vulnerability in which they can be like harassed, or that it can become that it become toxic. Okay, even abusive, or these things that happen. So what I would say is that building the coalition with those groups that you already can trust and find trust in. I often like to say, and maybe this is just my bias, I like to say that most of the mainline Christian groups tend to be progressive, and Hillel has been pretty good on this space. The Muslim student associations have been pretty good on this space. And then what I would do is I would have those really good conversations and say, who else is potentially able to have that conversation? It's very interesting because some of you are aware about InterVarsity creating this policy in the fall around not welcoming of LGBT inclusive persons, and I have had an awful lot of conversations with them. And yes, that is a huge problem, and especially if you're identifying in the queer community, that's a huge issue. And yet somehow InterVarsity may be the most civically engaged religious group that I have seen. And so there's this really interesting juxtaposition about wanting to keep arm's length with them, but also this opportunity to engage on these large scale, InterVarsity is doing work on Black Lives Matter, InterVarsity is doing work on racial justice and all these other things. And it's like, could you just not put yourself so far away from the queer community? And so it's interesting. So I would say every campus depends, but find your partners first, and if you need to, utilize them as a buffer between you and others if you need to. Yes, right here, sorry.
Okay, what would you say to student groups? So one of the things you're advocating
Right.
is secular student groups kind of setting aside their interests to advocate for the interests of the Jewish students at University of Minnesota who
Right.
get a kosher meal.
Right.
I don't know, and when I was a secular student on my campus, I would have been like, why would I do that? They already have it way better than me. I get worse treatment. I am not spending my time doing that for them. I don't know, maybe I'm just horrible.
I don't think you're horrible. I think you're coming from a natural, the way that we naturally approach this as human beings. I think the reality is that sometimes when you cash in your tokens and your chips for one group, it starts to pay off on the back end. And you also don't always know the history. I'm not sure that we always do a good job of telling the historical pieces, and I would say sometimes the administrators have good histories of, we remember when the Jewish community stood up when the atheists were having issues taking place among them. That may be something too. But I would always lean toward the side of trying to do better and build bridges. That's very Ibu Patel. Build bridges, not barriers from one another. Anything else? Then I'll stop talking, because I know you want to get to the dogma debate. Okay, thank you very much for paying attention.